Just 5 minutes, my son said through the glass, his voice muffled by the pain that separated us. 5 minutes, as if my entire presence, my entire being, could be measured out like a medicine dose or a ration of sugar. I looked down at my hands, wrapped in the thin hospital gloves they'd insisted we wear for safety, and then back at his face. His eyes darted to the car parked in the lot, where I saw the faint movement of his wife adjusting the rearview mirror. They had somewhere else to be, someone else to see, and I was a stop along the way. I checked my watch, though I already knew what it would say. The gesture wasn't about the time, it was about giving myself a small pause, a space in which to swallow down the ache before it spilled onto my face. My fingers, clumsy in the gloves, tugged them off one by one. I wanted at least the small dignity of my own skin meeting the cold air, of not feeling like a specimen sealed away in latex. The gloves made me feel like I was dangerous, untouchable, something to be contained. And that's when I felt it, the split between us. Not just the glass window that had stood between resident and visitor for months, not just the rules that had turned our embraces into nods through plastic. It was deeper, quieter, more permanent. A son who thought 5 minutes was enough. A son who had already measured me, weighed me, and found me small enough to fit into the margins of his day. I smiled at him anyway. Old habits die hard. I had smiled through worse, through nights when he came home late and drunk in his 20s, through mornings when he slammed doors in my face as a teenager, through years of sacrifice when I worked double shifts to keep food on our table after his father left. Smiling was easier than showing the hurt. Smiling was survival. He lifted his hand to the glass. I lifted mine in return, but without the glove, the cold shocked me. The pain was icy, and for a moment I wondered if he noticed I hadn't bothered with the barrier anymore. His lips moved, saying something about the kids being in the car, about a schedule, about promises to call soon. My eyes drifted to the horizon beyond the parking lot. It was late afternoon, the kind of pale winter light that makes the world look already half asleep. I nodded. That was all I did. Nodded like I agreed. Like I understood. Inside, something else began to turn. When he walked away, I stayed seated by the window. Other residents shuffled by, their wheelchairs creaking or walkers squeaking, each one carrying their own version of my story. I saw them every day, women who had once cradled babies who no longer visited, men who had built houses now crumbling in their absence, neighbors who once had bustling kitchens and loud dinners but now ate from plastic trays in silence. We didn't need to speak it aloud, the grief of being forgotten was a language in itself. But grief is complicated. It isn't just sadness. Sometimes it's anger, sharp and sudden, like a knife glinting in sunlight. Sometimes it's humiliation, like standing naked in a room full of people and realizing no one cares enough to look away. And sometimes, as I sat there with my bare palm pressed to the cold glass where my son's hand had been, grief felt like nothing at all. A dull quiet. A silence so deep it echoed. 5 minutes. I remembered the nights when I sat at his bedside, clocking hours that stretched into dawn, while he coughed for pneumonia at age 7. I had pressed cool cloths to his forehead, measured his medicine by droplet, prayed to a God I didn't even know if I believed in, promising I'd give up anything, even myself, if only my boy would live. I remembered how time didn't exist then. Minutes didn't matter. I had given everything, all of it, freely, without complaint, because love isn't rationed like sugar. Love isn't 5 minutes. I thought about the gloves again, lying limp on my lap. It struck me how much of life in this place was about containment. Gloves, masks, rules, schedules, charts. A body is measured by numbers, blood pressure, temperature, pulse. Even love is measured now, 5 minutes. I watched as his car pulled away. The taillights flickered red, then vanished around the bend. I stayed by the window long after, because leaving too soon would have made it look like I had somewhere else to be, too. But I didn't. I had nowhere but here. I was always here, waiting for others to decide how much of me they could handle. A nurse approached eventually, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum. "Do you want to come back to the lounge, dear?" she asked softly. Her face was kind, but practiced. Kindness here is like the plastic flowers on the tables, always present, never real. I nodded again. I seem to do a lot of nodding these days. On the way back to my room, I passed the bulletin board where they pinned photographs of staff birthdays and seasonal crafts. Someone had cut snowflakes from paper and taped them unevenly. They fluttered when the heat vent clicked on. I stopped for a moment, looking at one particular snowflake that had torn down the middle, held together by a strip of tape. That was me, I thought. Still holding, but not whole. In my room, the small space that held my whole world, I sank into the chair by the bed. The bed was neatly made, tighter than I ever used to manage at home, corners folded military sharp by orderlies who came in twice a day. I hated it. Beds are supposed to be lived in, wrinkled, carrying the shape of a body. This bed looked like it belonged to no one. Maybe that was the point. I thought again of the words, just 5 minutes. My son probably didn't mean to hurt me. He probably didn't even think. That was the cruelest part, that my pain was not born from cruelty, but from indifference. From the casual ease of someone who didn't know how deep his words cut because he didn't think of me that deeply at all. I sat there for a long time, the gloves still in my lap, my watch glinting faintly under the dim room light. I remembered the day I bought that watch, years ago, when money was tight and I had to count coins to make it happen. It wasn't vanity. It was practicality. I needed to keep time when I worked at the factory, shifts measured by whistles and breaks, by the rhythm of survival. That watch had marked every era of my life, the births of my children, the death of my husband, the countless hours of work and waiting. And now it marked the moment when my son told me my worth in minutes. It occurred to me then that watches don't measure time the way hearts do. Watches count seconds. Hearts count sacrifices. I leaned back, closing my eyes. The sounds of the nursing home drifted in, a television too loud in the lounge, a cough down the hall, a tray rattling on its way to dinner service. Life here is a chorus of small noises. Nothing sharp, nothing grand. Just a background hum of endings. And yet, somewhere beneath the hum, something inside me whispered. Not loudly, not defiantly. Just a small murmur, like the first stir of water under ice. A thought I hadn't let myself feel before, maybe 5 minutes wasn't enough. Not for him, not for me. I didn't know what I would do with that thought. But I held on to it, quietly, like a secret no one could take away. That night, I lay in bed with the blanket pulled up to my chin, staring at the ceiling where the shadows from the hallway light stretched and shifted. Sleep doesn't come easy anymore. It slips past me like a shy child, hovering just out of reach. I've heard people say that old age brings peace, that once you've lived long enough you settle into yourself like a stone finding its place in the river. Whoever said that never spent their nights counting the cracks in a ceiling, listening to the distant shuffle of orderlies, replaying words that shouldn't matter but do. Just 5 minutes. The phrase uncurled itself in my chest over and over, like a paper you crumple and smooth again, never quite rid of its wrinkles. I thought of my son's face, hurried, distracted, as though he was glancing at me while checking his watch. How many times had I looked at him with undivided attention, when the rest of the world could have burned and I would not have noticed? And here he was, older now, grown with responsibilities of his own, unable to grant me more than a pause between errands. It's not that I begrudge him his life. That would be too easy, too bitter. No, what unsettles me is the quiet realization that my place in his life has shifted. I am no longer the center of his universe. I am no longer even on the periphery in the way I once was. I am an obligation. A stop. A ticked box. And the cruel part is, I helped raise him into a man who could be busy, who could succeed, who could make a life so full there was little room for me. Isn't that what motherhood was supposed to be? To prepare them for a life beyond us? I rolled to my side, the stiff sheets whispering under me, and thought about the past. Memory is a double-edged thing. Some nights it comforts, like slipping your hand into an old coat pocket and finding a forgotten coin. Other nights it cuts deep, reminding you of the weight of what you gave. I remembered his small fingers clinging to mine when I walked him to school. The way he refused to let go until the teacher pried his hand from mine. I remembered the nights I stayed up patching his jeans at the knees because money was tight and new clothes were a luxury. I remembered skipping meals so he could eat, lying to him that I wasn't hungry. These aren't acts we parade or demand recognition for, they are the invisible currency of love. But when love is repaid in 5 minutes, you start to wonder whether those invisible coins ever bought anything at all. The next morning, the nurse came in to check my blood pressure. She was young, probably younger than my granddaughter, with hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She was efficient, polite, careful not to linger. I watched her wrap the cuff around my arm, listen to the beep of the monitor. Numbers appeared on the screen, and she scribbled them down on her chart. "Looks good today," she said, already halfway to the door. That's what I've become here, numbers. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels. I am data points in someone else's file. If you look only at the chart, you'd never know who I was, what I carried, what I'd lived. You'd never know about the nights I danced barefoot in the kitchen with my husband when he was still alive. You'd never know about the afternoons I read novels in the park while my children played. You'd never know about the years of work, the sweat, the prayers. A chart does not hold the sound of a lullaby sung at midnight. It holds numbers. After she left, I shuffled to the small mirror above the dresser. The face that looked back at me was a stranger some days. The skin side where it once was firm, eyes duller, mouth etched with lines carved by years of holding back words I wanted to say. I reached up, tracing a wrinkle at the corner of my eye. It felt like reading Braille on my own body, each line telling a story only I could hear. It struck me then that even I had begun to reduce myself. I'd started to see only what was gone, not what remained. My son's dismissal had sharpened that truth. If he could not see me, then I, too, was at risk of vanishing. Not in body, not yet, but in spirit. That thought lingered as I went about the day. The lounge smelled faintly of disinfectant and instant coffee, the kind that never tastes like anything real. Residents sat in clusters, some watching the television with blank stares, others nodding off in their chairs. I sat near the window, where the sun came through weakly. It was here, watching the light shift, that I noticed Mrs. Price. She was 92, nearly blind, but sharp as glass. She sat hunched, her cane leaning against her chair, and yet when she spoke, her voice carried authority. "They don't see us anymore," she said once, out of nowhere, as though plucking the thought from my own chest. "We become shadows. Convenient when they want to feel good about visiting, invisible when they don't." I nodded, my now familiar response, but she kept talking. "I told my son last week," I said, "don't bother coming if you're just going to stare at the clock." He thought I was being cruel. But I wasn't. I was being honest. Her words stirred something in me. Honesty. I couldn't remember the last time I had been truly honest with my son. I had smiled through his indifference, nodded through his excuses, softened my edges so he wouldn't feel guilty. Perhaps I had done him, and myself, a disservice. Perhaps love was not always about shielding. Sometimes love demanded truth, even if it bruised. Later, when lunch arrived on its plastic tray, mashed potatoes, peas, a slab of chicken drowning in gravy, I pushed the food around with my fork, appetite gone. The noise of utensils against plates, the chatter of aides urging us to eat, filled the room. Across from me, Mr. Harris, who rarely spoke, suddenly said, "My daughter hasn't called in 3 months." His voice cracked, but no one looked up. Loneliness is so common here it no longer startles. I thought then of how silence becomes our shared companion. We hold our griefs close, because to speak them is to risk sounding ungrateful. We're told to be thankful for the minutes we're given, as though the crumbs of love should taste like a feast. But I wasn't sure I wanted to be thankful anymore. Gratitude, when demanded, feels like begging. And I was tired of begging. That evening, I found myself sitting again by the window, watching as the sky burned pink and orange before slipping into gray. The world outside kept moving, cars on the road, children in the distance, people walking dogs. Life unfolded while we, behind these walls, were frozen in place. That was the hardest part, knowing that while my time was measured in medications and meals, theirs was measured in choices, in freedom. I remembered a day years ago, when my son was still small. We had gone to the beach, just the two of us, because his father had decided such things were beneath him. I remembered spreading out a blanket, unpacking sandwiches, watching as my boy ran toward the water with his arms flung wide. He had called to me, "Come on, Mama." And I had gone, splashing through the waves, laughing as the salt stung my legs. Time had stretched that day, wide and endless, as though the world belonged to us. That memory ached now, not because it was gone, but because of how far we had drifted from it. How had we gone from endless afternoons to 5 minutes at a window? The answer, I realized, was slow erosion. Not one single moment, but a series of small diminishments. First, the phone calls became shorter. Then the visits became less frequent. Excuses multiplied. And I accepted it, smiling, nodding, telling myself it was enough. Each acceptance shaved off a piece of me until there was barely anything left to demand more. But the whisper inside me, the one I had first heard the day before, grew louder. Maybe it didn't have to be this way. Maybe 5 minutes wasn't enough, not because I was greedy, but because I was still here. Still alive. Still deserving of more than the bare minimum. That night, as I slipped my gloves back onto the dresser, I made a small decision. Not a grand one, not the kind that changes the course of lives. Just a small act. I would no longer pretend I was satisfied with crumbs. I didn't know yet how to speak it, or what words I would use, but I knew I would stop nodding so easily. And in that quiet vow, something shifted. It wasn't freedom, not yet. But it was a beginning. Morning begins the same way here, every day, as though time is a loop that never quite progresses. A knock at the door, soft but insistent. "Good morning, Mrs. Taylor," the aide says, though she barely waits for my response before coming in. Curtains are pulled open, fluorescent lights flicked on, and the day begins whether I am ready for it or not. I often lie still, eyes closed, pretending I am asleep. It's one of the few games left to me, to see whether they will let me rest a moment longer. Sometimes they do. More often, they gently shake my shoulder, urging me up for breakfast. Efficiency matters here more than choice. The day has a schedule, and you must fit into it. I sit on the edge of the bed as they help me dress. My hands are slower now, fingers stiff, so buttons and laces take longer than they once did. I hate the way they rush me. "Here, let me," they say, fastening the buttons for me, tying the shoes. It is meant kindly, I suppose, but it feels like theft, stealing from me the small dignity of dressing myself. I have started insisting, softly but firmly. "No, I'll do it." Sometimes they sigh, sometimes they smile, but I push through, fumbling, because each button I close is a reminder that I am still capable of something. In the dining hall, breakfast is the same rotation: oatmeal, eggs, or toast. Nothing tastes quite right, no matter what I choose. Food here is fuel, not pleasure. Still, I sit at the table with Mrs. Price and Mr. Harris, and we exchange the same pleasantries. "How did you sleep?" "Cold last night." "The oatmeal's too thin again." Conversation is habit, not connection, but habit is its own kind of comfort. What strikes me, day after day, is how invisible we become in this place. Staff rush past, pushing carts, delivering pills, checking boxes. We are obstacles to maneuver, tasks to complete. I do not fault them entirely, their work is endless, and the system is built on speed. But it leaves us diminished, as though we are only shells, not souls. I think of my son again during these mornings. I imagine him eating breakfast at his own table, perhaps reading the paper, perhaps scrolling on his phone. I wonder if he ever thinks of me while drinking his coffee. Or do I cross his mind only when guilt tugs at him, when he remembers he hasn't visited in weeks? That thought gnaws at me, because I spent decades thinking of him every single day. Motherhood does not end, even when your children are grown. You carry them, even when they no longer carry you. But something is changing in me. The wound of 5 minutes has not closed, but it has hardened into something else. A question, persistent and insistent: what do I still have that cannot be reduced, measured, or ignored? It begins with small things. I make my bed myself, before the aides arrive, smoothing the sheets with shaky hands. It may not be as neat as theirs, but it is mine, rumpled corners and all. I begin writing again, scribbling in the notebook my granddaughter once gave me. At first it is only fragments, lines of thought, half-remembered poems, descriptions of the sky outside my window. But slowly, the words gather. They remind me that my voice has not gone quiet, not yet. One afternoon, while others napped or watched television, I sat by the window with my notebook. The sun slanted across the floor, and the dust motes swirled like tiny planets. I wrote, "Time is not only what is given to us. It is also what we claim." The sentence startled me, as though someone else had written it. I read it over and over, feeling its truth settle deep inside me. Mrs. Price noticed me writing and asked what I was doing. I told her I was keeping a journal. She laughed, sharp and approving. "Good," she said. "If we don't tell our own stories, they'll erase us entirely." Her words stayed with me. To be erased, that is what I feared most. Not death, not pain, but erasure. To live a whole life, full of love and labor, and then vanish as though none of it had mattered. 5 minutes at a window is the beginning of erasure. A life confined to charts and schedules is another. But to write, to speak, to insist on being seen, that is resistance. I began noticing other ways to resist. When the nurse tried to hurry me through my walk down the hall, I slowed deliberately, savoring each step. When the recreation aide suggested a craft I had no interest in, I declined politely instead of nodding along. When the chaplain came by offering prayers, I told him plainly that I had my own ways of talking to God. Small things, yes. But each refusal was a reclamation. Each no is a way of saying, I am still here, and I still choose. Not everyone approved. Some staff grew impatient. Some residents looked at me as though I was being difficult. But I didn't care. For too long, I had let myself be easy. Easy to please, easy to dismiss. Easy to fit into 5 minutes. One evening, as we sat in the lounge, the television blaring a sitcom laugh track, I turned to Mrs. Price and asked, "Do you ever wish you had demanded more from your children?" She smirked, her blind eyes glinting with something fierce. "Every day," she said. "But demanding more doesn't mean they'll give it. Sometimes it just means you stop shrinking yourself for them." Her words lit something in me. Stop shrinking myself. That was exactly it. I had been folding smaller and smaller, like paper, until I could fit into the margins of my son's life. But I wasn't paper. I wasn't disposable. Later that night, I sat again with my notebook. I wrote, "I will no longer measure myself by what is given to me. I will measure myself by what I keep for myself." The act of writing these lines filled me with a kind of warmth I hadn't felt in years. Not joy exactly, not hope, but strength. A strength that came from within, not from anyone else's approval. The next day, during visiting hours, I saw other families through the glass windows. Children bringing flowers, spouses bringing photographs, voices muffled by barriers. Some visits were long, some were short. But all of them ended the same way, with someone walking away, and someone left behind. I watched carefully, not out of envy but out of clarity. I realized then that we all waited too much, for phone calls, for visits, for scraps of attention. Our lives had been reduced to waiting rooms. I decided I would wait less. Not because I expected more, but because waiting was wasting the time I still had. That afternoon, instead of sitting idly, I went to the activity room and asked for paints. The aide looked surprised but brought them out. I dipped the brush into color, my hands shaky, and let the strokes fall across paper. What I painted was nothing remarkable, swirls of blue and gold, the suggestion of a sky. But it was mine. Creation, not consumption. Expression, not erasure. When I was done, I pinned the painting above my bed. A reminder. A declaration. Mrs. Price saw it later and said, "You've got some fight in you after all." I smiled, not the practiced smile I used for my son, but a real one. "Maybe I do," I said. And in that moment, I realized something else. Dignity is not given. It is claimed. It is not in the hands of those who ration their time, or those who hurry you along. It is in the small, stubborn acts of insisting on your own worth. Dressing yourself, writing your words, painting your colors. Refusing to vanish quietly. I thought again of my son. I still longed for his presence, still wished for more than 5 minutes. But I no longer believed that his absence defined me. My life was not reduced to his choices. My worth was not diminished by his neglect. It was a fragile realization, like a flame cupped in the wind. But it was mine. And for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of a self that had been buried under layers of sacrifice, silence, and nodding. As I lay down that night, I glanced at my painting, the colors catching the faint glow of the night light. I whispered to myself, "I am still here." And the words did not feel hollow. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice the way people looked at me differently. Not everyone, of course. To most staff I was still another name on a chart, another resident who needed pills and help with shoes. But some noticed the small changes. The aide who saw me button my own blouse without flinching when it took longer. The nurse who caught me scribbling in my notebook late at night and paused, curious, before moving on. Even Mrs. Price raised her brow one afternoon and said, "You've stopped nodding so much." It was true. I no longer accepted everything handed to me in silence. If the oatmeal was cold, I said so. If I wasn't hungry, I refused the plate instead of pushing food around politely. If an activity bored me, I chose something else. Tiny decisions, really, but together they felt like stones stacked into a wall, not to keep others out, but to build myself back up. One afternoon, I asked the recreation aide if I could sit by the piano. "Do you play?" she asked, surprised. I hadn't touched a piano in years, but once upon a time music had been my second language. My hands were stiff, clumsy on the keys, but I managed a halting version of an old hymn. A few residents drifted closer, listening. For the first time in years, the sound of my own creation filled the room. I stumbled, yes, but I also remembered. Remembered the evenings I played lullabies for my children, the way music had once made our small house feel grand. When I finished, Mrs. Price clapped her hands together once, sharply. Others followed. I laughed, embarrassed but proud. "I'm rusty," I said. But inside, I thought, I am not gone yet. That night, the thought followed me to bed. For so long I had lived as though I were already fading, already half buried. My son's words had stung because they confirmed what I feared, that I was already being erased. But what if erasure wasn't inevitable? What if I could carve marks, even small ones, into the days that remained? The next visiting day, I dressed with care. Not in the plain sweater I usually wore, but in a blouse I had saved, one with soft embroidery along the cuffs. I brushed my hair myself, slow but steady, and pinned on the small brooch my husband once gave me. It wasn't about vanity. It was about showing up as more than a shadow behind glass. When my son arrived, his visit was longer than usual, 15 minutes instead of 5. Still hurried, still distracted, but I noticed his eyes linger on my blouse, on the brooch. "You look nice today, Mom," he said through the speaker. Simple words, almost casual, but they landed heavily. Because I realized he was seeing me, if only for a moment, not just the resident he dropped in on. I wanted to tell him then, to say outright, "I am not a chore." I am not a time slot. I am your mother, still whole, still here. But the words caught in my throat. I wasn't ready. Not yet. But the desire to speak them burned stronger than it ever had. After he left, I sat by the window, watching his car pull away. And instead of sinking into the familiar ache, I reached for my notebook. I wrote down the words I hadn't said. I am not a chore. I am not a time slot. Seeing them on the page gave me a kind of courage I hadn't felt before. Later that evening, I joined a group of residents for bingo. I had never cared much for it, but I went anyway, curious to see whether I could feel part of something, even in this small way. And when I won a round, a laughably small prize, a chocolate bar, I raised it in the air and declared, "Victory." The others laughed, clapped, and for a fleeting moment the room felt less like a holding pen and more like a place where life still stirred. Mrs. Price leaned over and whispered, "You've found your spark." Maybe I had. Or maybe it had never left, maybe it had only been smothered under years of silence and nodding. Either way, I felt it now, alive and insistent. That night, before sleep, I laid my gloves on the dresser and stared at them. They had become a symbol to me, of barriers, of distance, of being treated like something fragile and untouchable. I thought about the day my son first said 5 minutes, and how I had taken them off, bare-skinned against the cold glass. That gesture had been unconscious then. But now I understood it differently. It wasn't just surrender. It was protest. It was me saying, without words, I deserve more than this plastic separation. And for the first time, I began to believe that one day soon, I would tell him so. The next time my son visited, I was ready. I hadn't rehearsed my words exactly, but I had carried them in my chest for weeks, letting them grow heavy until silence became impossible. I dressed again with care, the embroidered blouse, the brooch, hair brushed smooth. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, the sky outside washed in pale spring light. His children stayed in the car again, faces glowing blue from their tablets. He walked toward the window briskly, phone in hand, tapping at the screen until he saw me. Then he slipped it into his pocket, smiled, and lifted his hand to the glass. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice carried that practiced cheerfulness people use when they're in a hurry but trying not to show it. I raised my hand, bare this time, no gloves between me and the cold pain. For a moment, we stood in silence, palms separated by the thickness of glass, mother and son reflected back at one another. "How are you?" he asked. I could have answered the way I always did, fine, good, managing. But instead, I let the truth come. "Lonely," I said. The word surprised us both, hanging in the air heavier than it should have been. His smile faltered. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. Things have just been so busy. Work's been." 5 minutes, I interrupted, my voice steadier than I felt. "That's what you gave me last time. 5 minutes. Do you know how that sounded to me?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Mom, I didn't mean." "I know you didn't mean it," I said. "That's the point. You didn't mean it, but you said it. You thought it. You measured me in minutes without even realizing." My throat tightened, but I pressed on. "Do you have any idea how many hours I spent sitting by your bed when you were sick as a boy? How many years I worked, saved, went without, just so you could have more? I never counted. Not once. And now here I am, and I'm worth 5 minutes?" His face reddened, shame flickering through his eyes. He looked down at his shoes, then back up at me. "Mom, it's not like that. You know I love you." "I don't doubt that you love me," I said. My voice softened then, but it did not waver. But love is not measured in words said at windows. Love is shown in presence, in time, in attention. I don't want gifts or flowers or promises. I want you. I want more than 5 minutes of you." The silence stretched between us. I could see him struggling, the way his jaw clenched as he searched for something to say. Finally, he pressed his hand harder to the glass. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the lines at the corners of his eyes, the weight of responsibility pressing his shoulders down. He was no longer the boy who had clung to me at the school gate. He was a man, tired and busy, torn between obligations. I did not hate him for it. But I could not let him shrink me into an afterthought either. "I don't want your guilt," I said quietly. "I just want your time. Not all of it. Just enough to remind me I'm still your mother. Enough to remind me I still matter." His eyes filled then, though he tried to hide it. He nodded slowly. "You do matter, Mom. More than I've shown. I'll do better." I pressed my hand to the glass again, meeting his. My palm burned with cold, but my chest felt lighter than it had in months. For the first time since that painful day, I felt as though he had heard me. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. The visit lasted 20 minutes that day. Longer than any in recent memory. He told me about work, about the children, about his wife's garden. I listened, but more importantly, he listened back. He asked how I was doing, really doing, and when I said I had started writing again, he smiled. "You always did love your notebooks," he said. When he finally stood to go, I felt the familiar ache of parting, but it was different this time. There was no hollow despair, no bitter echo of 5 minutes. Instead, there was the memory of truth spoken, of dignity reclaimed. After he left, I sat with Mrs. Price in the lounge. She tilted her head toward me, sensing the shift in my mood. "So," she said, "did you finally tell him?" I smiled. "I did. And he listened." She chuckled, low and approving. "Good. Don't stop now. Once you start speaking, it gets easier." That night, I opened my notebook and wrote, "I am not erased. I am not 5 minutes. I am here." And for the first time, I believed the words were not just for me, but for him too. It is a strange thing, how the days can feel both endless and fleeting at once. Here, the routines fold into each other like sheets pressed too many times, and yet, since I spoke to my son, really spoke, something inside me has shifted. The walls are still the same, the food is still bland, the staff still hurry. But I am different. And because I am different, the sameness no longer holds me the way it did. I wake earlier now, before the footsteps in the hall. I sit by the window and let the weak light soak into me like a kind of baptism. Some mornings I write. Some mornings I simply watch, taking in every car that passes, every bird that dares the fence line. I never used to give such attention to small things. But when your life narrows, you learn to love details fiercely. The soft scrape of slippers against tile. The scent of coffee drifting from the lounge. The muted laughter of a nurse when she thinks no one is listening. These fragments remind me that life, even here, has texture. My son has been more present. Not perfectly, life still pulls him in many directions, but more. When he visits now, he brings a kind of stillness with him, as though he is learning not to rush the minutes. He asks about my writing. He tells me about his children, their squabbles and victories. Sometimes he asks for advice, the way he once did when he was younger. That is what startles me most, to be asked again, to be needed not just as a figure in the past but as a voice in his present. I don't fool myself into thinking we have rewound time. We cannot go back to the days of sandcastles on beaches, or long talks at the kitchen table. Too much has passed, and we are different people now. But what I have gained is something steadier, recognition. The sense that I am seen again, not as a patient or a burden, but as his mother. One afternoon, we sat in the garden, our chairs placed under the stubborn little tree that insists on blooming before the weather is ready. The air smelled of damp earth, sharp and honest. He handed me a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Nothing much, he said, embarrassed, as if apologizing in advance. Inside was a fountain pen, heavier than any I had held in years. For your notebook, he said. So you'll keep writing. I turned it in my hands, the weight anchoring me. A pen, such a simple thing, yet more than a gift. It was a recognition of the words I had been pouring onto paper, the words he now knew existed. I touched his arm lightly and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded, and for a long while we didn't speak. We didn't need to. That night I wrote in the notebook with the new pen. The ink flowed smooth, the letters darker, surer. I wrote, "I am not 5 minutes. I am not invisible. I am here." And as the words bled onto the page, I felt as though they stitched something back together inside me. Life at the home hasn't become easier, but it feels less suffocating. I take ownership of my hours now. I paint when I want to, even if the strokes are clumsy. I hum old hymns at the piano, letting the sound linger in the stale air. I say no when I mean no, yes when I mean yes, and nothing when silence is truer. I am not waiting anymore, not in the same way. The other residents notice. Mrs. Price teases me that I've grown uppity, though her smile betrays admiration. Mr. Harris, usually so quiet, surprised me once by asking if I'd read my writing aloud. I did, just a small passage about the garden, the tree, the early blossoms. When I finished, he closed his eyes and whispered, "That's exactly what it looks like." For a moment, the room felt larger, as if our words had opened it beyond its walls. My son's children have come too. They sit on the grass, restless, fidgeting, reminding me of him when he was young. My granddaughter asked why the flowers on the tree opened before others. I told her, some things can't wait. They want to live fully, even if the world isn't ready. She nodded, thoughtful in the way children can be. My grandson asked why I write so much. I told him it was so I wouldn't forget who I was. "Do you forget sometimes?" he asked. I looked at him, his eyes so like his father's had been at that age, and answered honestly, "Yes. But writing brings me back." In those moments, I realized that legacy isn't always in grand gestures. It can be in a story told to a child, in a ribbon tied, in a sentence written with care. My life may be quieter now, but it is not over. And perhaps the greatest rebellion of all is to live it on my own terms, even in this place. Not every day is strong. Some mornings I wake heavy with the weight of age and grief, and the silence presses too hard. Some evenings the ache of being left behind stirs again. But when it does, I return to the sentence I wrote that first day after the confrontation, "I am still here." It steadies me like a prayer. The gloves remain on my dresser. I still use them when required, but I no longer see them only as symbols of distance. Now they remind me of choice, that I can put them on, and I can take them off. That even in small ways, I control how I meet the world. On my last birthday, my son came without rushing, without glancing at his watch. He stayed through the afternoon, long enough that the sunlight slanted and dimmed. We shared cake, we laughed at memories, we sat in silence when the laughter ran out. At the end, when he rose to go, he pressed his palm to mine through the glass, the way we always had, but then, unexpectedly, he whispered, "More than 5 minutes, Mom." "Always more." I held his gaze, my hand firm against the pane, and answered softly, "That's all I wanted." That night, when I returned to my room, I opened my notebook to a fresh page. With the fountain pen warm in my grip, I wrote the words that had come to define me. I will not be measured by the time given to me, but by the moments I claim as mine. And then I closed the book, set it on the table, and sat back in the dark, the quiet wrapping around me not like a shroud, but like a shawl. For the first time in a long time, I felt not forgotten, not erased, but whole.